And we're back. So, episode 4 of the podcast. And I have some exciting news. I think we have a name for the pod. So, if you see here this banner, ETH Call is the name we're proposing. We'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. It's a fun little play on words. Obviously, this is a podcast. So, we're doing sort of, it's sort of like a call. But in addition to that, it's basically one of the most commonly used functions in Ethereum. So, it's used to call read only functions of a smart contract. So it shows, I think this is a good example. We're a little more technical, let's say. We're a little more focused on the fundamentals. And yeah, I think it's a great name. We like it. It's fun. It's a little different. It's quirky. Let us know what you think below. But I think this is what we're going to go with, unless folks really don't like it. So yeah. But with that, we should probably get started. We have some big news today, or as of tomorrow, actually. Ethereum's Shapella upgrade will be live here. So big news. Chandler has changed his background to Shanghai in celebration of the upgrade. So Chandler, why don't you kick things off and share what's happening tomorrow?
I'm actually in Shanghai. Don't let the janky AI fool you. I'm totally in the city. But yes, you are right. Tomorrow we actually have the Shapella upgrade, the combination of the consensus layer and the execution layer upgrades, Shapella and Shanghai and Capella being kind of colloquially called the Shapella upgrade. If that's not a tongue twister, then I don't know what is. So what's the most important thing about this upgrade? Why should you care? It's in my personal view, the kind of culmination of the entire merge and the kind of final step from the Ethereum kind of move from proof of work to proof of stake, finally getting its full level of completion. So it enables withdrawals, which means all the staked ETH that we staked back in the Beacon chain pre the merge, that became now the validation capital for the merge, is now able to be withdrawn. Financial flows in and out of the Beacon chain can happen in not exactly equal measure. There will be some sort of restriction on withdrawals. And I personally think that this is going to have a net positive for staking. It'll attract a lot more people. It means that people don't have to lock up their capital for as long as they originally had to in the beginning. In the beginning, it was quite a scary kind of commitment to be able to set up a validator and stake ETH. It was a one-way call. There was no guarantee that that you'd be able to withdraw. And now we're at the stage where you will be able to withdraw. So very exciting time for the entire ecosystem.
And I will link this below, but if we look at the network readiness, or the client readiness, I should say, you can see that most people are running the compatible client version. I think everyone's expecting a very smooth transition. So nothing to worry about on a technical level, at least hope not. We'll cross our fingers. But on an economic level, there's obviously a ton of questions about what this means for the price of ETH. All of this ETH that was locked up, about 10% or so of the supply was locked up. Obviously, most of that, like 70% of that, was in the form of LSDs. So you could trade that locked up ETH. But there's still a significant portion of capital that was locked up, that's been stuck for a while. Some people are at a profit, some are at a loss. And now folks are trying to sort of figure out, over the next few weeks, what does that timeline to withdraw your balance look like? If a lot of people want to join the exit queue, it could take months to unstake your ETH. But on the flip side, if not many folks are trying to withdraw, you could get out rather quickly. And of course, what does that mean? Are people going to reshuffle into LSDs? Are people going to sell their ETH? We don't really know yet. But one thing I wanted to point out is you can see the exit queue capacity. We're only a day away from when the upgrade's going live, and you can see only about 0.65% of validators have fully exited, meaning they've unstaked their ETH and they're ready to withdraw or try to withdraw as soon as tomorrow. So to me, this tells me, we're just a day out, maybe a little over if you count the hours. We're basically just a day out and not many people are trying to exit. Yes, they're giving up their yield from the time they've exited to when they can actually withdraw. But for just a day or for just 2 days, that's not really that significant. And so this tells me that maybe the exit queue is not going to take as long as we thought. I think Coinbase announced that it could take months. I was sort of the impression last week that it would take months as well. But, if this number stays low and the capacity doesn't get blown out of proportion, there really could be like a small reshuffling that happens initially. And that could just be it. So what are your thoughts there, Chandler? I think I'm going to revise my my call of a 10%, potential drop in price due to selling down. I think this is probably all priced in, and there might be no impact, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling very confident in my prediction that we made a little while ago, where I said that withdrawals being enabled will actually be an unclimactic event. It'll be pretty chill, not too much happening. And I think this indicates that as well. I want to also just maybe mention, and for the sake of clarity, talk about two different types of withdrawals that will happen when withdrawals are enabled. You were talking about the full withdrawals, and that's basically a person that wants to take their rewards and their entire balance in their staking validator and completely remove it and basically bring all their ETH back and hold it. That's what we call a full withdrawal. There is another type of withdrawal that will be enabled, and I think this is where a kind of interesting dynamic on where I think most of the sell pressure will actually come from, and that's partial withdrawals, or you can kind of think of it as skimming all your rewards. This is where all validators that have accumulated, let's say, I think the median amount of ETH in each staker is around 34 ETH, which means that most stakers have probably got about 2 ETH of rewards that are over and above that 32. And so partial withdrawals will enable them to basically skim that 2 ETH at the top and leave their validator with 32 ETH at any given point in time. And so I think the partial withdrawals are going to be an interesting fact that happens, going to be an interesting dynamic for just basically figuring out how much sell pressure there will be. But even if that is the case, I do think that we're not going to see too much reshuffling, and the amount of ETH that will be skimmed from the rewards might give some sort of temporary sell pressure, but ultimately I think that many of the users will kind of take those rewards, maybe use it in kind of DeFi platforms, maybe use them in some of the other staking services that are out there. But ultimately, I think that my price prediction is still looking fairly confident at the moment.
Yeah, that's a win for you, that's for sure. But I mean, we're still a day out, so who knows? I just really wanted to quickly highlight, if you have questions about what's happening tomorrow, what's going to change, there's a great FAQ put out actually by the Ethereum Foundation that I will link below. It's pretty good. It covers most of the things you'd be wondering, but there's a little more out there, but it's pretty solid, I would say. And the next topic we wanted to debate is actually about what this article deems as the perils of restaking. This is kind of a hot topic, just with withdrawals coming online tomorrow, with Eigenlayer getting a lot of prominence, and with liquid staking derivatives just being the talk of the town lately. So we have a lot to cover on this, but before we get into that, it's probably helpful to introduce the concept of what is Eigenlayer. So Chandler, why don't you, give us just a quick primer on what restaking is here.
The primitive that the Eigenlayer team have been working on is this concept of restaking. And so what Eigenlayer will do is basically create a smart contract that allows kind of additional rule sets that can be placed on your staker. And those additional rule sets can earn you additional yield. So it's kind of like a perfect concept of adding extra risk, but also getting extra rewards. And why this has kind of taken the ecosystem by a lot of, basically by storm. And I kind of want to maybe just point out two particular areas where, if you're wondering why does restaking matter, if you can kind of conceptualize it. And that's just around oracles, right? Oracles are basically this concept of bringing some sort of economic guarantee around off-chain data and making it valid on-chain. And you can only really trust it up until the point that you trust that security mechanism. Well, now that you can kind of use the Ethereum staking capital behind it, it adds not necessarily a trustless system, but as little trust as it possibly can enter. So, if you're an Oracle network, you can kind of create an Eigenlayer-based application that will bring data on-chain, and it'd be a bit more trusted. The other one is the bridging ecosystem. Bridging ecosystems often have some sort of validation on, is this bridge valid? That's a question that you're asking. Did these assets move from one contract to another? If so, allow it to happen on another chain. Using an Eigenlayer type system really makes that design space on how you can design bridges a lot wider, which I find personally interesting. And I think maybe to add just one more additional item there, and I think this is the part that's really interesting, is that you can create consensus-based mechanisms using your staked ETH for something that's non-EVM compatible. Ethereum can be the mother settlement layer of every single chain out there in the world, and all it really has to do is, pay the kind of security costs of that Eigenlayer, the Eigenlayer economics, which there aren't too many example use cases out there, but I totally think that we'll see a few more coming out in the near future.
One thing I just wanted to highlight too, because I don't think you mentioned it, is that you can actually do this restaking with, for now, and this is testnet, Rocket Pool Ether and Lido's staked Ether. And I think this makes, let's say, the problems that we'll outline in this article much more significant, because you're not restaking your validator, you're restaking this LSD token. And that basically changes the economics, which we'll get into in just a bit in that article. But yeah, I think it's just important to note you would basically restake your Lido staked Ether, your Rocket Pool Ether, and let's say there's a uni chain someday for Uniswap. At some point you could imagine just staking your Lido staked Ether in there to get an additional yield, hypothetically paid in uni tokens. Obviously, that's just an example that we're using, but that's sort of how you could think about it, is that Uniswap would be paying like additional fees to get you to stake your Ether, maybe 1%, maybe 2%, something small like that. But with that said, I think we can transition over, now that you guys are familiar with Eigenlayer, for those that weren't, what this article calls the endgame perils of restaking. And basically this article outlines that before restaking and before LSD tokens like staked ETH and Rocket Pool ETH, there was this equilibrium that was expected where the staking yield would naturally wind up. The real yield would be about, let's see, just under 2%, and the nominal yield that's after inflation would come out at like 2.8%, and about 33% of the total supply was staked. And as far as I can tell, researchers at the Ethereum Foundation, developers, etc., thought this was sort of optimal, because this basically means that the Beacon chain, or excuse me, the Ethereum chain is paying out less in rewards than if everyone was staked, right? Although yields go down as more people stake, the network has to pay out more tokens overall the more folks stake, and this continues to dilute people. But the issue here is that the equilibrium, which is about 33%, gets pushed out further with these LSDs and with Eigenlayer. Basically, if you're using Eigenlayer to stake, or you're just using Lido and it's sort of like this risk-free yield you can get on chain easily, more and more folks are going to stake, and that's going to push us past the equilibrium. It's going to dilute the yields to possibly net negative after inflation. And it's going to mean that the Ethereum chain has to emit more ETH annually overall than it would if we just had this healthy equilibrium without these other products built on top of ETH staking. Now, obviously, there is a benefit, right? If you have more ETH staked, the network is more secure and harder to attack. But of course, it comes at a downside. So yeah, what are your thoughts, Chandler? I know we have different perspectives on this article overall.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and I think from just kind of the concept of what is like the perfect amount of staked ETH, that equilibrium currently sits, and this article models it really, really well, at some sort of value that you have enough capital within the ecosystem to secure it, as well as enough of that capital in circulation for it to become a utility and basically be used in the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Everyone goes ultrasound money, ETH is money, ETH is the money of the Ethereum blockchain. And so the minute you start incentivizing rewards in external facets and kind of like bring an inflow, it changes that equilibrium like somewhat. And I think that change in equilibrium will be somewhat different. Like if you look at some of the other proof of stake chains like Cardano, there's a significant portion of staked Cardano, but that's because there's no other use of Cardano. So I see kind of this this concept being a very interesting play between Ether's use case as its own kind of asset within its own ecosystem, as well as this like kind of like security force. And I think we're going to see post withdrawals, and kind of this is why it's really exciting to talk about this, right before Shapella, is that post withdrawals we're going to kind of see that actual like pendulum play out, and I think that's kind of the where a lot of discussion will happen in the near future.
Yeah. And one other thing, I talked a little bit about how monopolies will form in the staking business. I'm personally of the mindset that the monopoly that a platform will have will just continue to grow. And that's because I think this is more of like a commodity service. Like there's really it's not like Lido's getting a better yield than Coinbase staked ETH. It's not like any validators really outperforming another significantly, especially when you're at scale like all of these are. They're all getting basically the same yield over time. And what I think is going to happen is fees are going to compress to near zero. So Coinbase charges 25% for their CBETH product. Rocket Pool charges 15%. Lido charges 10%. In my view, these fees are a race to the bottom just because the service is the same. So I don't see in a post-withdrawal world how Coinbase doesn't have to cut their fees. I don't see how Rocket Pool doesn't have to cut their fees. And I don't see how Lido doesn't end up cutting their fees when everyone else comes down too. So I think it's going to be a race to the bottom. I don't think fees will hit 0%, but I think they're going to get really low. And you can also see how, this is obviously an estimate, but how the fees impact how much is staked. So fees are, let's say, on average between 10 and 20%. You can see that equilibrium is between 25 and 30% of the supply staked. But the lower you bring fees down, the more of the supply is staked, just because, it's going to encourage more folks staking. So I think the fees are raised to zero. More stake is going to enter into, a smaller number of different pools. And I think that monopoly is going to push out the equilibrium more. This article also goes on to make the case that these LSD projects are basically incentivized, of course, to get as much stake as they can. And then once they have that monopoly, it becomes very hard for anyone else to compete. So that's another case for capping the validator count. But yeah, overall, this is just a really fascinating article. I highly recommend it to everyone. It's certainly very important, I think. And I think it's going to become more important over the next year too.
I had a question, Justin, that I think I'd love for anyone in watching this video. If you want to put your answer down in the comments, that would be great. But it's more of an open-ended question. So, everyone knows right now that the Ethereum ecosystem is moving from its, L1 chain, and its scaling solution is an L2 chain, which basically every single L2 uses Ethereum as a settlement layer and a security layer. Ultimately, Eigenlayer and these kind of restaking primitives will have that same flavor to it. Do you think that the way that Eigenlayer is going about it versus how the L2 ecosystem goes about it ultimately sets up Ethereum as the global settlement layer, or do you think it complicates that a lot more?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know how to answer that question perfectly, but I'll try. So what I've been thinking a lot about lately is, I'm just pulling up this Eigenlayer page again for folks just listening, but you can stake Rocket Pool ETH, you can stake Lido staked ETH, you can stake these LSD tokens. And when I think about this, it's sort of, I don't see the benefit to staking a ETH staking token versus staking, let's just say USDC to secure something. So when you have these LSDs, the risk-free rate for ETH is going to be whatever the LSDs are yielding. Let's just say 3%. For whatever reason, I think it's like 4% now. So whatever, 4%. That's the risk-free rate for ETH. That's your opportunity cost, and that's the yield you're going to demand anywhere anyway. With USDC and stablecoins on-chain, the risk-free rate is like, very low, like 1% or 2% on Aave, let's say. So I don't really see the benefit to staking an LSD and Eigenlayer versus just staking USDC. Like if the Uniswap chain needs to get security and it needs an asset that, can be slashed if there's malicious actors validating the network, I don't see how staking an LSD is any different than staking USDC. In my mind, the cost for, again, this is a random example, for Uniswap to incentivize this stake, I don't really see the benefit for incentivizing Ether versus USDC yet. I could be missing something, but if we're talking, if this article is right and the real yields for LSDs is going to be negative after inflation, then wouldn't users be better off staking USDC, USDT, a stablecoin, maybe WBTC, something like that to secure the network? I know it's a little controversial of a take, but I'm still kind of thinking through this and trying to understand. So I don't know. What are your thoughts there, Chandler?
I definitely think that there'll be use cases that happen outside of just simply using staked ETH as its kind of monetary capital backing. So the economic costs of being able to run one of these systems will be a lot more efficient because that ETH is already staked. Ultimately, if you want to set up a Uniswap chain that uses USDC as its backing, as its validator set, you got to find a way to get that USDC into its ecosystem. And so I think that will be kind of where the benefit of having, this asset's already staked, the tech's already there, there is some sort of like team building the functionality and the piping for you that I think the benefit at the moment is that it's going to be super simple and super easy. Maybe not in the beginning, but that's the end game, right? Whereas go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing I want to point out is like, I understand this for like, let's just talk about Cosmos or Solana. Solana is a good example. It's down like 90 something %, let's just say, against the dollar. And so the network security is lower now because the value is lower. If you replace the consensus mechanism with ETH and you used ETH to validate the Solana network, sure, it's more secure. ETH is more stable. Of course, it did go down 75%, but that's a lot different than going down 95%, right? So I get that, but I don't get why you like the advantage to using ETH versus WBTC, USDC. I guess you can make the case that people in crypto are happier to hold ETH and speculate on that. But at the end of the day, it's still just a user taking a bet on an asset. They're either betting on the dollar, they're betting on ETH, they're betting on BTC, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And this becomes a lot more of an interesting question and an interesting thought pattern when you think about ETH securing other non-EVM and non-ETH based chains, right? Does it even make sense? Is this something that actually would work out? I definitely don't have, just like you, I don't have a clear answer on this. And so this is why it's a particular fascination between the two of us. And if anyone has any interesting ideas, I would love to hear them in the comments.
Yeah. One other thing I did want to point out of how Eigenlayer plays into this, we talked about LSDs, but this chart I'll explain in just a second, but it basically simulates what will happen when a restaking platform comes online. And this model is just with an external yield of only 0.75% additionally. So in my Uniswap example, I was saying maybe Uni has to pay out 1%, 2%. I think that's reasonable. 0.75% is certainly conservative. But you can see here that the percent of the supply staked drastically goes up when this external APR comes online, because again, it's like, why wouldn't you get this yield? And so you can see that that's really going to push the stake supply out. And that's why Eigenlayer will have a significant impact, for better or worse. I think, the jury's still out on that, but, rational actors will certainly use Eigenlayer as long as it's safe and secure. And over the next few years, you can imagine that the equilibrium will not rest at 33%, which is really just like a 2 to 3x of how much stake we have now. It'll go up to, I think, 60, 70, 80%. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I also maybe want to prefix that with the author of this article is actually an amazing author. I personally love this article, and the other work that this author has done has kind of got a lot of depth and credibility behind it. But at the end of the day, it's still a model. Ultimately, the dynamics of how Ethereum will play out and its kind of monetary policy is something that was very well thought out. It took 5 years for them to figure it out and kind of debate it, and there was a lot of back and forths. And ultimately, here's a new protocol that's actually going to shift those metrics around. And I personally think Ethereum will kind of withstand that. There's no stopping kind of concepts of basically bringing primitives like Eigenlayer in, but
yeah,
what's the actual end effect? I think this is one of the best articles that we have found out there on what this will actually mean for the ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we have to build around it. I don't think Eigenlayer is a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. I just think you have to build a system that's resilient enough to withstand whatever crazy things people are going to build on top of your network, because anyone can do it. It's permissionless, and we want to see that innovation in the experiment. So with that, we'll close things off on the show. Let us know what you think of the name ETH Call right there. You can let us know in the comments. And with that said, we will see you on the next one. Thank you all so much for listening. Bye, everyone.
It's going to be a long flight from Shanghai for me.